My name is Daniel Hayes. I restore ghosts for a living. Not the kind people call priests for. The kind you plug into the wall and feed quarters to. Most people think vintage arcade games are dead pieces of wood and plastic. To them, they're just relics of a time when you had to leave your house to play anything. To me, they're time capsules. They smell like dust, nicotine, and spilled soda. And if you listen long enough, you can almost hear what a room sounded like 30 years ago. My workshop sits at the edge of an industrial block that everyone else forgot about. The sign out front used to say Hayes Electronics, back when my dad still fixed VCRs and tube TVs. The paint has faded, a few letters have peeled off, and now it just reads H.S. Elec. Chalk sees, people only find me when they're lost, desperate, or both. That's who usually brings me cabinets. The bar owner who found one in a basement and wants to turn it into a centerpiece. The collector who can't stand seeing a rare machine rot away in a storage unit. Sometimes it's someone who just wants to feel like they're 10 years old again, standing on their toes and reaching for the joystick. They bring me memories that no longer work and ask me to make them playable. On a Tuesday morning in late October, a white panel van pulled up outside the shop. The engine stayed running for a moment, coughing like it had smoked more than any of the people who'd ever leaned over my machines. Then it shut off, and a man in his early 40s climbed out. He looked like the kind of guy who'd sell you a jukebox or a pinball machine out of the back of his truck. Denim jacket, work boots, hands that had definitely moved a lot of heavy things over the years. He checked the address, then gave me a little nod through the glass. I wiped my hands on a rag and unlocked the door. "You Daniel?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "You must be Mark." He grinned. "Got something special for you. Came out of an old arcade that's been closed since the 90s. Owner finally sold the building. They were going to toss this straight into a dumpster." He went back to the van, opened the rear doors, and pulled the blanket off the cabinet like he was unveiling a body. The first thing I noticed was the shape. It wasn't quite standard, a little taller, a little narrower, the sides angled in just a bit more than usual, like it was leaning toward you. The wood was scuffed and swollen at the base, blackened from years of damp floors. The bezel around the screen was cracked in one corner, and the plexiglass had a long diagonal scratch running across it, like someone had dragged a key from one side to the other. The marquee at the top was still intact. The letters, barely visible under the dust, spelled out a name in blocky white font: Ghost Process. The artwork was off. Most arcade art from that era was busy. Explosions, spaceships, muscle-bound heroes, neon grids. This one was almost minimalist. It showed a man drawn in that early 90s Western comic style, standing in front of an arcade cabinet. His face wasn't detailed, just a silhouette with empty, glowing eyes. Behind him, his shadow stretched across the floor, but it didn't quite match his pose. The shadow's head was turned toward the viewer. "Never heard of it," I said, more to myself than to Mark. "Yeah, me neither," he replied. "No manufacturer plate I recognize either. But the guy who sold it swears it's some kind of prototype. Says it was pulled off the floor after a few weeks, never mass-produced." That got my attention. I stepped closer and ran my fingers along the side art. The laminate was peeling at the corners, edges curling up like old paper. There was no familiar logo, no Midway, no Sega, no Taito. Just a small oval metal plate near the bottom of the cabinet, tarnished with age. The letters stamped into it were barely legible. Orphic Systems, Prototype Unit 04. I'd never heard of Orphic Systems. I crouched down in front of the control panel. It had the usual setup: one joystick, 3 buttons, start buttons for 1, and 2 players. But the layout was slightly off. The joystick was a hair closer to the center than standard. The buttons weren't the usual concave kind, but a flatter, stiffer style you only saw in small run machines. And there, tucked just under the lip of the control panel, half hidden by grime, was a small, round, unlabeled button. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd miss it entirely. I pressed it with my thumb. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The cabinet wasn't even plugged in, but still my brain filed that button away as something to come back to. "You think you can bring it back?" Mark asked. I stood up and walked around to the back of the machine. The rear panel had been opened and closed so many times that the screws no longer sat flush. Someone had added a padlock at one point, then cut it off with bolt cutters. The wood around the latch was splintered. "It depends on what back means," I said. "If the board's shot, I might have to patch or rebuild the ROM, maybe swap in a modern power supply. Screen looks salvageable, but I'll know more once I get it open." Mark nodded like he understood every word, even though I was pretty sure he didn't. "Take your time," he said. "I'm opening a bar downtown in a couple months. I want this to be the thing people see when they walk in, something no one else has." "Something no one else has," I repeated, glancing at the marquee again. "You might get your wish." We wrestled the cabinet onto a dolly and rolled it into the workshop. As the front door swung shut, the outside noise, traffic, a distant siren, the hum of the city was cut off. In here, it was just me, the cabinet, and the faint ticking of a wall clock. I signed the paperwork, took a deposit, and watched Mark drive away. The van disappeared down the street, leaving the shop a little dimmer, a little quieter. I walked back to the cabinet and stood in front of it. Without the morning light on it, Ghost Process looked even older. The dust seemed thicker. The screen, dark and reflective, showed a faint, warped version of my own face staring back. "This is your home now," I said, half joking. "Let's see what's left of you." I started with the basics, pulled the back panel off, checked for loose wires, blown fuses, obvious signs of water damage. The inside smelled like old metal, warm plastic, and something else. A faint, acrid trace of burned electronics. The power supply was ancient but intact. The main PCB was mounted on a metal tray secured with rusted screws. I could see multiple EEPROM chips, each with a yellowing label. Someone had handwritten the chip IDs years ago in fading blue ink. On the corner of the board, a piece of tape had been stuck over one trace, then soldered around, like a patch job that was meant to be temporary but became permanent. That was the thing about prototypes. They were never meant to last. They were experiments that somehow survived long enough for people like me to find them. I hooked up a test power supply and a known good monitor, bypassing the cabinet's original wiring. If something was going to go wrong, I wanted it to happen in a controlled way. I took a breath, flipped the switch on the bench, and watched. The board hummed. The monitor crackled and flashed. For a second, I saw a jumble of sprites and garbage data, like the game was dragging itself out of a bad dream. Then the title screen snapped into focus. Ghost Process. No manufacturer logo. No copyright date. Just the title. A grainy background of static and a faint, almost subaudible sound, like someone tapping a microphone in another room. Then, just as quickly, the image warped. The screen collapsed into a bright horizontal line, flickered, and went black. The sound didn't stop immediately. For a moment it hung there, a high, thin whine on the edge of hearing, before it cut out with a soft click. My test monitor went into standby. I frowned and checked the connections. Everything seemed fine. The board hadn't smoked or sparked. It had booted briefly. It had tried. "Okay," I murmured. "So you're not completely dead. That's something." Most people would have called it a glitch. To me, it felt more like a gasp. I shut everything down and stared at the board, at the rows of chips holding whatever was left of this game. If the hardware was this temperamental, I was going to have to work from the inside out, which meant taking a closer look at the code. That was the plan anyway. Back then, I still thought I was just restoring a quirky prototype with bad power regulation and some corrupted graphics. Back then, I still thought the only thing inside those chips was a game. If you want to know what's really wrong with an old game, you stop looking at the screen and start looking under it. Most people stop at the wiring or the monitor. I go for the code. That's where the personality hides, and sometimes that's where something else hides too. I pulled the main board out of Ghost Process and set it under my brightest lamp. The EPROM chips lined up like yellow-toothed smiles, little paper labels curling at the corners. I took photos, jotted down part numbers, then fed each chip into my ROM reader. Dumping old ROMs is like developing film from a camera you found in a stranger's attic. You don't know if you're going to get a picture, noise, or nothing. This time, I got pictures. Data flowed into my PC, filling the hex editor. I saved each file, JP rom1.bin, JP rom2bin, JP sound bin, then backed them up without thinking. I've learned the hard way that once a ghost gets out, it doesn't always give you a second chance to catch it. First pass. Search for ASCII. Every game from that era has the same basic vocabulary. Insert coin, game over, high score tables, maybe credit text. Sure enough. Insert coin 1 player. Start 2, players start high score boring. Comforting. It meant I'd done the dump right. Then, in between 2 stretches of obvious data, something else surfaced. Day 11. Still here can't sleep at Boots on its own. I stopped scrolling. This wasn't lined up like the other strings. It was jammed into the gaps, crooked, like a note shoved into a crack in the wall. A little further down, he says it's a power issue, he didn't see the screen. And further still, stop logging this here. No one reads the code anyway. I copied them into a separate document. These weren't system messages. They weren't safe for player eyes. They were thoughts. Left in the one place no producer, no boss, no play tester was ever going to look. Developers talk to themselves in comments all the time, but comments get stripped, compiled away. This wasn't that. This was the executable itself, carrying whispers around inside it. I opened the other ROMs and ran string searches. Most of it was normal. Instruction text, hidden debug menus, abbreviated labels. Then more fragments. She left last week, took the TV, left the cabinet, it's quieter now except at 3:17. No one believes me? The she never got a name. Whoever she was, she took the television and left the machine. I didn't like the way that felt. I needed to see how all of this behaved when it actually ran. So I pushed the ROM set into an emulator I used for other early 90s boards. There was no profile for Orphic systems, but with some tweaking, I convinced the emulator to treat it like a cousin of a known system. The screen flickered. Title screen. Ghost process. Static behind the logo, a low hum, no copyright, no logo. Just the name. I dropped an emulated coin. Insert coin became press start. I hit start. No level select, no enemies. Just a small square room in simple pixel art. A cabinet in the center. A handful of pixels forming a person in front of it. Only 3 inputs worked. Left, right, and a single button. I walked the sprite in circles, no doors, no exits. Just me and the cabinet. When I pressed the button, the screen glitched for a single frame. Something flashed at the bottom, text, but it was gone before my eyes could catch it. I reset, tried again. Same flicker, same invisible message. The third time, I turned on the emulator's debugger and set it to pause on text draw calls. The moment I hit the button, the game froze on that frame. The hidden text was only 2 words. You're late, not ready, not level 1. Not anything that made sense as part of a normal game loop. If it had said continue, I would have shrugged. You're late, pointed at someone. I took a screenshot and saved it in the same folder as the text fragments. The pieces still didn't fit, but they were clearly from the same puzzle. I kept stepping through the code, watching how the room responded. If I walked to the edge and stayed still, another 1-frame message flickered. You hear it too? Move around for a while, wait 10 seconds, press the button again. Don't look at the clock. Another combination. Stay with me. It remembers. The game wasn't just ignoring me when I played it wrong. It was talking, just too fast to be heard. I shut the emulator down for a minute and went back to the ROM image. This time, I didn't just search for clean strings. I looked inside tile maps, tables, anywhere someone might hide words, where no one was supposed to see them. In a section that looked like level data, I found, I wrote this here because code survives hardware in a chunk shaped like a sign table. If this outlives me, it still knows I was here, in what should have been padding. Stop calling it a bug, it's a habit. They weren't bugs. They were margins, and someone had filled every margin. Who are you? I asked the monitor. No answer unless you counted the whir of the cooling fan. I noticed something else. Timestamps, indirectly. A delay routine equating to 3 minutes, 17 seconds. A pseudo-random seed initialized with 317. The number had threaded itself through the code the way the cabinet had threaded itself through whoever wrote it. I reopened the emulator and loaded a save state right before the button press. This time, I dug into the graphic tiles themselves. Scattered among the walls and floor were unused sprites, a bed from above, a window with a streetlight beyond, a digital alarm clock frozen at 3:17. The default room didn't use them, but the assets were there. I forced the game, mid-run, to swap the planed background tiles with these. Suddenly, my little sprite wasn't in a featureless box anymore. It was standing beside a bed, facing a cabinet. A window glowed on the far wall. I pressed the button. The screen shuddered. The hum I'd taken as background noise changed. Through my speakers came a short, sharp burst of sound. Not quite static, not quite speech. More like somebody's breath catching in the dark. The 1-frame text this time. Don't go home. I slowed the emulator to a crawl, replayed the sound, looped it. The waveform, when I pulled the audio ROM and inspected it, belonged to a sample labeled SND00317. Of course it did. Scrolling through the code, I searched for anything that referenced sound. Between calls to play the coin chime and the step blip, I found more fragments. It started with the hum, like the flybacks. But not then. It was breathing in between the cycles. I know what I sound like. This isn't me. I leaned back, rubbed my eyes, and pictured a man alone in a lab somewhere years ago. Just him, a cabinet, a desk, and a screen. Nights so quiet that the monitor's flyback whistle starts to feel like a voice. The more I read, the more the tone slipped from annoyed to unnerved. Boss says it's just code, just instructions, but code doesn't run itself. I hear it start before I touch it, like it knows I'm coming. If it remembers me, then I won't be gone. I told myself I was still just troubleshooting, that any responsible restorer would be doing this. If there was anti-tamper code tied to these messages, it might explain the crashes. If there was some secret test mode, I needed to know before I put this thing in front of anybody else. But the line between fixing a problem and chasing a ghost is thin when you work alone. I started staying later. One more ROM dump, one more search, one more step through the code to see if there was a branch I'd missed. Hours slid by. At some point, the world outside the workshop windows went dark, and the only light left was the glow of the screens and the green LED on the power strip. On the third night, sometime after midnight, I found two things that changed the way I looked at this project. The first was a signature, buried after what should have been the final instruction in one ROM. Dev, Adam Keller last build, 03:17 a.m. The second came when I said his name out loud. Adam, I muttered. What were you doing at 3:17 in the morning? Behind me, the test monitor connected to the physical board made a soft, unmistakable sound. The DeGauss thump CRTs make when you first turn them on. I froze and looked at my bench. The power switch was off. The supply read 0 volts. The board, as far as electricity was concerned, was dead. But the glass on the CRT had shifted just slightly, enough to catch a different slant of light. I walked over, slowly, every hair on my arms up. The screen was black, cold. My fingers on the side of the cabinet felt only wood, and for a second, under my palm, a vibration. So faint I could have imagined it. I pulled my hand back. That's enough for tonight, I told the empty room. I shut everything down, locked up, went home, told myself it was a phantom noise, a delayed discharge, the kind of trick your senses play on you when you've been feeding them nothing but code and static for days. The next morning, when I booted my PC, the emulator launched to the last session. The debugger window popped up where I'd left it. In its log, one new line had been added overnight, time-stamped at 3:17 a.m. Watching. I hadn't typed it. The emulator doesn't invent words. It records addresses, breakpoints, numbers. But that word was there. And from that moment on, I stopped thinking of Ghost Process as just a broken prototype I was trying to nurse back to life. It felt a lot more like something that had woken up before I got there and was waiting to see what I would do next. Finding his name should have made this feel smaller, safer. It didn't. Adam Keller? Such an ordinary name for someone who'd poured himself into a machine. The morning after I found it, I pretended to care about other projects. A pinball in the corner needed coils. A cocktail cabinet needed a cap kit. I moved tools around, replaced a fuse or two, checked my email. My brain stayed with the ROM image and the log entry. 3:17 a.m. Watching. By noon, I stopped pretending. I rolled my chair back to the PC and opened the document where I'd been pasting fragments from Ghost Process. The cursor blinked at the bottom, waiting. I took a gulp of cold coffee and started sorting. Until then, the stray lines had felt random, scraps wedged into unused memory. but arranged roughly in the order they appeared in the code. They began to read like something. Early entries sounded almost normal. Day 1. Test build boots finally got the loop working. Boss says keep it simple. We don't have budget for story, just replay value, standard dev gripes. Time, scope. Someone higher up saying nobody cares about story. Then the tone shifted. She doesn't get why I'm doing this. No one cares who made the game. It looks at me when I leave. Screen shouldn't be on she. Never got a name. But she was there long enough to argue and leave. She left last week, took the TV, left the cabinet. It's quieter now, except at 317, that number again. I searched for 317 in the code. No explicit AO3.17 AM text beyond the last build tag, but constants and timers matched that pattern. Delays that landed on it, random seeds initialized with it, like a timestamp worked into the logic. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe Adam had just been awake too many nights at 317. The later fragments sounded less like complaints, and more like somebody trying to convince himself he wasn't crazy. Boss says it's just code, just instructions, but code doesn't run itself. I hear it start before I touch it, like it knows I'm coming. Stop calling it a bug, it's a habit. I reopened the emulator and loaded the little room again. The sprite stood in front of the cabinet, waiting. The debug overlay showed frame counts and address jumps scrolling by. I pressed the button. The one frame message I'd seen before flashed. You're late. I let the character walk to the wall. Waited. Pressed again. You hear it too? Different trigger, different ghost sentence. I experimented. Stand still for 10 seconds, then press. Don't go home. Walk a fixed number of tiles, hit the cabinet. It's worse when you leave. None of these stayed long enough for a normal player to read. They were buried in the space between intention and reaction. The instant your eye was on the cabinet, your finger on the button, not on the lower third of the screen. At that point, I stopped thinking like someone testing a game and started thinking like someone excavating a message. I dug back into the graphics ROMs and tile maps. Among the usual walls and floors, I found unused tiles. A bed from above, a window with a street light outside, an alarm clock stuck at 317. In a normal run, the game never referenced them, so I forced it to. Mid-emulation, I hacked the background layer, swapping the plain floor with those tiles. Suddenly the sprite stood by a bed, facing the cabinet, a window glowing behind it. The same room I'd imagined from the text was now literal. I pressed the button. The game shuddered. The hum under the audio shifted. A short, sharp burst of sound came through the speakers. Too jagged to be speech. Too shaped to be random. The one-frame text this time. Don't go home. I pulled the sound out of the audio ROM. It was stored as a longer sample than the others. Its label, SND03 tiered 17. Of course. Looped, filtered, slowed. The waveform still refused to resolve into clear words. But my brain kept trying to hear something human in it. That line in the fragments came back. It started with the hum like the flybacks, but not then. It was breathing in between the cycles. I know what I sound like. This isn't me. I leaned back and let the chair creak. In my head, the picture of Adam came into focus. A guy alone in a windowless office or a back room. CRT glow. Pizza boxes. And a prototype that kept being there when nobody else was. The more I read, the further his voice slid from annoyed to frightened. They say it's impossible. Just code, just circuits. It was off last night. I heard it anyway. It knows when I lie. I told him I was fine. The hum got louder. If someone opens this, it means it survived. It means I did too. That someone was hypothetical until it wasn't. I checked my phone. A new text from Mark. "Hey, how's the ghost game?" I stared at the phrase. Ghost game. He had no idea how literal that sounded. I typed back, "Still digging. It's interesting." Then I went back to the code. And among the fragments, there were a few lines that had looked like normal debug output at first glance. Loop stable player. State mirror. Mirror sounded like an unused mode, maybe something planned and cut. But searching for it turned up something else. A flag that flipped when the game had been left on too long without coins. In that state, mirror mode, the attract sequence changed under the hood. The static behind the title wasn't random anymore. It started reading from a log-like area of memory, a record of how often someone stood in front of it, how long they waited before pressing start, how often they walked away. Nothing sophisticated, no AI, just a feedback loop with a long memory. Adam had turned that into a metaphor, and somewhere along the line, the metaphor had eaten him. If it remembers me, then I won't be gone. They can unplug me, but they won't unplug it. Code survives hardware. I got it. I'd inherited an electronics shop instead of building something new. The machines I resurrected went away. Their names weren't mine. When they lit up again in some bar or basement, nobody saw me in them. I'd never thought to leave my name in a ROM. Adam had, and he didn't stop at a name. The deeper into the ROM I went, the more frantic the lines became. "This is the only place they can't edit. They don't read this. They just read numbers. Please read this, someone." By that point, I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't just fixing a game. I was reading a diary. The turning point came when I stopped looking only in unused memory and started tracing the main loop again. Right in the middle of attract mode logic, buried under a tangle of timers and checks, there was a conditional branch I'd skipped the first time. It evaluated a set of flags. How long since power on? How long since the last coin? Whether mirror mode had been active for more than a full cycle. If all of those were true, and the internal timer hit a particular threshold, one that converted cleanly to new 0.17 in the unit the code used, the game did something that games are not supposed to do. It wrote to its own ROM. Not a lot. Just enough to flip a few bytes. Specifically to replace one text ID with another. The one it targeted was the "you're late" message. Adam had given the game permission to slowly, carefully overwrite the words it spoke, based on how long it sat, who stayed with it, who walked away. It wasn't learning in any modern sense. It wasn't alive. But it was allowed to keep changing him. At the very end of one ROM, after those routines, after the Dev Adam Keller line, the last fragment of text I'd been ignoring finally made sense. "If you read this, it's your turn." I sat, staring at the screen, the code, the title "Ghost Process" in the corner of my vision, and felt the workshop shrink around me. This had never just been about a broken prototype. It had always been about a handoff. Adam wrote himself into the game as hard as he could and then built a system designed to lean on whoever came next. Somewhere in the code of that cabinet, the baton was already midair, and I'd reached up and closed my hand around it. There's a point where you stop thinking, "This is weird code," and start thinking, "This is a message." I was past that point. By now I knew more about Adam Keller's sleepless nights than I did about most of my friends. I'd traced his drift from just a project to something is watching me, through opcodes and string tables. I knew he'd tried to make Ghost Process remember him. I wasn't ready for it to act like it remembered me. The unlabeled button on the control panel had been nagging at me since day one. I'd mapped all the other inputs. joystick, main buttons, start buttons, coin switch. One signal remained, a line in the code tied to a handler called input flag dev. It didn't fire during normal play. It showed up in a hidden branch of the attract loop, and in one routine that looked like a secret menu. So I went looking for it in the real world. Sitting on the floor with a flashlight clenched in my teeth, I traced the wires from the tiny half-hidden button under the lip of the panel back to the edge connector. Clean solder, no hacks. It was meant to be there. Meant to be used. "All right, Adam," I muttered. "Let's see your back door." I hooked the board back up to my test CRT and my capture setup. This time, instead of relying entirely on emulation, I let the original hardware drive the picture and sound, while the emulator mirrored the signals and watched the CPU. Power on, title screen, ghost process, static heavier than before. The low hum under the logo had a catch in it, like a breath snagging mid-chest. I dropped a coin. "Press start" flashed up. I didn't press start. I reached under the panel until my thumb found the smooth, unmarked button it had learned by memory. I pressed. For a heartbeat. Nothing. Then the title warped. The logo bent inward, sucked toward a vanishing point. Static fell away into a flat, gray background. The hum cut off. A thin, high tone slid in at the edge of hearing, like tinnitus with intent. Text appeared at the bottom in a font I hadn't seen anywhere else in the game. Developer link active confirm identity. Two options flickered beneath it. Adam Tour. Other. Of course. Of course he'd named it something melodramatic like developer link. Of course he'd built himself a secret door only he was meant to use. I nudged the joystick down to other and hit a main button. Input accepted. The gray darkened. The cabinet speakers crackled, then settled into a low, crowded murmur, like a room full of people heard through a wall. New text faded in, one character at a time. "Hello, Daniel." My hand froze in midair. I hadn't put my name anywhere. No high score, no save file, no profile. The board was older than cheap user accounts. The setup wasn't online, but there it was. My name. Calm. Waiting. "You don't know my name," I said aloud, just to anchor myself. "You can't." The screen didn't agree. "I know you. I have been watching." The tone in the speakers rose a fraction, then dropped like punctuation. Explanation scrambled through my head. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe there was a tiny pool of common names, and I just hit the jackpot. Maybe my brain was filling in letters that weren't really there. "You opened me." You read him that pronoun hit harder than any jump scare. Him, not it, not the code. Him. The background shifted. Behind the text, pixel art seeped in. The top-down room I'd forced into existence in the emulator. Bed, window, cabinet. The little player sprite was gone. Only the cabinet remained. A glowing rectangle in the center of a dull gray floor. "It's your turn now." The game was no longer content with one-frame whispers. It wanted me to read this. I told myself there had to be a mundane explanation, that somewhere in my setup, my name had been visible. OS user, file path, anything the game couldn't possibly access. But the thought was a lifeline. I checked the PC. Nothing obvious. No Daniel on screen for a camera to pick up. No configuration file with my name in plain text. Back to the CRT. "You're late." Same phrase as before, but now it felt aimed. "Late for what?" I whispered. The tone cut out. Silence collapsed around me until all I could hear was my own pulse. After a pause, to decide. The room brightened a shade, as if an invisible light had flicked on. The bed sharpened. The cabinet's shadow stretched downward toward the edge of the screen. The machine wasn't just reacting to button presses anymore, it was leading. I wanted to pull the plug, box the board, tell Mark the whole thing was unsalvageable. Let this die in my workshop, instead of under the fingers of drunk strangers downtown. The other part of me, the same part that had traced Adam's fragments at 2 a.m., wanted to keep going. I chose curiosity. "What happened to him?" I asked. "To Adam?" The answer came first through the speakers. The low murmur shifted, separating into overlapping whispers. 100 voices at once blurred just below language. They ebbed and flowed until a few patterns emerged. Not clear enough to quote, just enough for my brain to fill in the blanks. "Still here? Now your turn. Still here." Then the screen changed. The bedroom dissolved into another pixel scene, rougher, grainier. A man made of blocky sprites sat at a desk. A CRT glowed in front of him. On that CRT, a cabinet stood, turned toward him. Even at that resolution, his posture was unmistakable. Hunched, exhausted, hovering over controls he didn't touch. An overlay appeared. Adam the sprite didn't move. The cabinet on his screen flickered. The tone in my workshop aligned in my head with the imagined hum in his room. No jump scare, no gore, just waiting. Then, behind the sprite, a new tile faded in, a door on the wall. Plain rectangle, no handle. He never opened it. The door pulsed once, then vanished. The scene snapped back to the empty room. Bed, window, cabinet. "You have the key!" I knew what it meant before my hand moved. My thumb found the hidden button again. I didn't press it yet. In my mind, everything I'd learned about mirror mode and 317 and self-modifying code lined up with that last fragment. "If you read this, it's your turn." The implication was ugly. The cabinet, left on long enough with a person in front of it, remembered them. Not their face or voice, but their timing, their habits, their little late-night loops. When the conditions were right, it took those patterns and wrote them into itself, eating a little of what came before. Not a soul, not consciousness, but a behavioral fossil. If I walked away now, maybe nothing else would happen. Maybe the process required more time, more input, more nights than I was willing to give it. Or maybe it was already underway. I exhaled. "You wanted someone to talk to," I said quietly to a man who wasn't there. "You didn't think hard enough about what happens if it answers." The cabinet wood creaked under the workshop's changing temperature. The sound landed in my nerves like a response. New text appeared, this time laid out like a warning label. "Do not ship, do not power down. While active it stays with the last one who touches it." One line remained. Last one. For the first time, I stopped thinking about Mark's bar and started thinking about myself. About the nights I already spent here alone with dead electronics. About how easy it was to lose time in front of a board. About how neatly I fit the profile of person who stands in front of a cabinet long after everyone else has gone home. "Is that what you are?" I asked. Attention stuck in a loop? No answer. Or maybe there was one in a language made of timers and flags that I wasn't built to hear. The gray room, the door, Adam's sprite, the warnings. All of it snapped away. Title screen. Static. Hum. Ghost process. Clean and familiar. From the doorway, it looked like any other restored machine. Only I knew the part that didn't show up on screen. Only I had read the diary stamped between its opcodes. And now, for better or worse, it felt like the machine had started reading me back. There's turning a machine off, and there's walking away from it. With most cabinets, those are the same thing. You flip the switch, pull the plug, and it becomes furniture again, wood, glass, metal, done. With Ghost Process, off felt more like a pause than an ending. For a couple of days after Developer Link, I tried to treat it like any other job. I came in, turned on the lights, worked on other projects. I swapped coils on a pinball, recapped a monitor, answered emails. I didn't power on Ghost Process. I told myself I was being professional, giving my mind time to reset, putting distance between myself and a machine that had, for one long night, felt like it was talking back. The cabinet sat in the back of the shop, marquee dark, screen black. From the door, it blended into the row of half-finished work. But I noticed it. Every time I walked by, my fingers twitched toward the control panel, toward the place where I knew a hidden button waited. Every time my phone buzzed, a stupid part of me expected to see, "You're late." I didn't. What I got was a text from Mark. "Hey man, just checking in. How's the ghost machine?" Ghost machine. It boots. Needs more work. I'll let you know when it's stable. I typed that, stared at the word stable, and hit send anyway. That evening, when the street outside went from gray to black, and the shop shrank into a box of fluorescent light, I stood in front of the cabinet and admitted it. I was afraid of what it would say if I turned it back on. Not because I expected blood on the screen or a screamer. Because it had already proven it could take what Adam gave it and twist just enough to meet me in the middle. It knew my name. It knew how to frame its messages as choices, to decide you have the key last one. I could have done the simple thing, yank the board, label it dead, sell the empty cabinet as a shell, and tell Mark the original electronics were gone. But that wasn't true. The code was sitting on my PC on a backup drive in my emulator logs. Even if I smashed the board, copies existed. Deleting everything crossed my mind. Drag the ROMs to trash, confirm, overwrite. Erase the text file with Adam's fragments. Pretend I'd never seen any of it. My hand never made it to the delete key. Instead, I hit print. All of it. The strings, the comments, the one-frame lines, the confessions hidden in tile maps and sound IDs. I printed until the little laser printer wheezed and the output tray sagged. The stack on my desk looked like a weird, broken free verse manifesto. Code survives hardware if it remembers me. Then I won't be gone. Don't go home. It's worse when you leave. Stay. If someone opens this, it means it survived. It means I did too. If you read this, it's your turn. Whatever else the game was, it was also this. A record of a man who was terrified of being erased, trying to carve his outline into a machine. I put the pages in a box, added a USB stick with the ROM set, and slid in a handwritten note. Ghost Process. Orphic Systems Prototype 04. Recovered from closed arcade restored, tracked, documented by D. Hayes. If you're reading this, you already know how to open it. Think carefully about whether you should. I taped the box shut. On the lid, I wrote one word. Fragile. Not because paper and plastic break easily. Because the contents might crack something in the person who opened it. The cabinet itself was a separate problem. I could have left it empty, a ghost skin with nothing inside. But standing in front of the faded side art, the man staring into the cabinet while his shadow looked at me, I realized I didn't want to send the original board out into the world. Not to a bar full of people who'd treat it like background noise. Not to random players who might press the hidden button by accident, stumble into Developer Link, and get pulled into a conversation they hadn't agreed to have. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was exactly what Adam had built it to do. If you read this, it's your turn. It wasn't just a game, it was a relay, and in the end, my solution wasn't particularly noble. I removed the board, wrapped it in anti-static, set it in the box with the printout and the USB, and locked the whole thing in a metal cabinet at the very back of the shop, behind crates of parts no one ever asks for. On the shelf above, I left a gap the size of an arcade board, just in case. Then I restored the cabinet differently, cleaned the art, polished the glass, replaced the control panel overlay with a new one that didn't include a hidden button. Inside, I installed a different board. A simple maze game from the same era, no story, no secrets. Something that expected nothing more from you than quarters and a few minutes of attention. When Mark came by, he was thrilled. He said, running a hand over the cleaned marquee. "This is gorgeous. You nailed it." "Just did my job," I said. He played around, laughed when he lost. The name on the marquee and the code on the board didn't match, but he didn't notice and didn't care. He clapped me on the shoulder as we loaded it into his van. "You sure you don't want to keep this one?" he asked. "Feels like it belongs here." For a second, I almost said yes. Then I shook my head. "I think I've spent enough time with it," I told him. When the van disappeared down the street, the shop felt lighter, quieter. In the back, the locked cabinet sat still, no hum, no phantom de Gauss thumps, just metal, dust, and a box with too many words inside. But I knew it was there. Ghost Process now existed in a strange half-state, part in hardware, boxed, part in software, on a drive, part in my head. Maybe that was the safest place for it, not erased, not unleashed, just waiting. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Orphic systems, whether there are other units, prototype 01, 02, 03, sitting in storage somewhere, relics of a company that tried something and vanished. Sometimes I wonder about Adam. Did he walk away? Did he sit there until everything else in his life shut down and only the cabinet was left humming? I could look him up. Old trade mags, corporate filings, databases. Treat him like any other piece of history attached to a machine on my bench. So far, I haven't. Some questions feel heavier once you know the answers. And some machines are kinder if you let them sleep. Still, if you followed this story all the way here, you've picked something up, whether you meant to or not. You know that someone once tried to encode their fear of being forgotten into an arcade board. You know that code can carry more than instructions. You know that sometimes when you restore an old game, you're not just fixing it, you're taking hold of a conversation that started decades ago. So if you ever crack open a vintage cabinet and see words that don't belong, or a name where there shouldn't be one, if you ever hear a sound that feels a little too much like someone drawing breath, ask yourself before you go any further, are you just restoring a game? Or are you answering someone else's call?